Earlier today, the Supreme Court had hearings over the so-called Biden student loan forgiveness plan. It's an unconstitutional scheme on the face of it. Well, sometimes I wonder if the Supreme Court justices walk in on something like this and say, "Oh, I waste anybody's time here. Let's just be done with it." But they spent time with questions and answers, and apparently it was only the conservative justices who were skeptical of this obviously unconstitutional scheme. Let's bring in Giancarlo Canaparo. He's a senior legal fellow at Heritage Foundation. Maybe he knows a little bit more than I do about that. To me, I've seen my schoolhouse rock. He can't do this, Giancarlo.
Well, one of the big problems that this all comes out of is every once in a while, Congress gets the idea in its head that it doesn't want to legislate on hard questions, especially when there are emergencies. So it writes some broad statute that purports to give the president a broad authority to deal with an emergency. And that's what happened here. They wrote a statute that was geared towards predominantly military service members deployed overseas after 9/11. And they gave the president some authority to waive and modify, is the eminently unclear statutory language, to waive and modify the provisions of student loan programs for their benefit. Now, Biden has taken that and run with it in a big way, saying that this applies actually to all borrowers, well, 95.5% of all borrowers in America, and everyone making less than the top 5% of income. And so the question.
And I just want to jump in here. The statute you're talking about that Congress passed, it was in the wake of the 9/11 terrorism attacks on our country and the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, and the intervening economic hit that we took because of it. To suggest that 20 years ago those lawmakers said, "Oh, well, yeah, and if there's ever a pandemic in the 2020s, sure, this applies to them too."
Well, and you hit on an important point, which is that at no point in this act's history has it ever been used to excuse a single loan or a single dollar of debt. Every time it has been used for temporary programs, temporary relief, temporary pauses, lowering inflation, or to eliminate administrative burdens. But never has it been used as a nationwide policy tool. But Biden thinks he can do that here. And at the Supreme Court, we saw some skepticism today at least from the conservative justices. The three liberal justices seemed pretty gung-ho about this. They seemed to think that, right, first of all, they thought that nobody has what's called standing to sue. Nobody has a right to be in court to challenge this. And that this is all perfectly fine. Congress's delegation was very broad, functionally limitless, really, is how the liberals seem to view this law.
In your expert legal opinion, there's two different sort of approaches being taken today in the Supreme Court, one on an individual basis, another from the state's perspective. I've seen a lot of analysis that suggests states, specifically the state of Missouri, and the way they approach this is probably the strongest with regard to standing. How do you analyze the arguments here?
Sure. So standing, just as a quick refresher, is this legal doctrine that says if you want to be able to get into court, you have to have a real case, a live case, which means you have to have suffered a real injury, which is caused by the person you're suing, that a court can fix. So the states say, look, we have a bunch of these state agencies, and what they do is they service loans. So they get a contract with the federal government, and the government says, we issue these loans. If you do all the background work for us, communicating with the borrower, et cetera, we pay you for them. If you wipe those out, the borrowers, in this case, Missouri's student loan servicer, stands to lose about 45% of its revenue. And the state says, look, that's state revenue. This is a state agency. So this is our harm and harm to our citizens who benefit from that money being put towards educational programs and loans and scholarships. Now, the liberal justices seem to think that wasn't a good enough argument. They seem to think that the state agency is actually not really an arm of the state, at least not for this purpose. It's an arm of the state for some purposes, but it's a separate entity for others. Really hard to see, how you're going to draw a clear and consistent line there. But they really seemed to think that that was not sufficient to give these borrowers standing, or rather the agencies.
Giancarlo, just on the the logical face of it, let's face it, Barack Obama was president for 8 years. If he thought he had even the slightest ability to do this sort of thing when he was president, God knows he would have done it, right? I mean, he already stretched his constitutional authority with DACA and with the Affordable Care Act and with other moves that he made. Even he didn't think that it was so audacious that he could do this sort of thing. So I know that that's not a legal argument, but it's just
Well,
obvious on the face of it that Biden can't do this.
it actually, to some extent, is in a way a legal argument. The question is, does the statute that Congress passed allow the president to forgive student loans? And part of that analysis is, did Congress think that that's what they were doing? In fact, it's worse than just Obama not thinking he could do it. In fact, progressive activists didn't even think that using the HEROES Act, is what it's called, was the way that Biden could do this. They said that Biden might be able to do this under another act. And then Biden came out of left field with this HEROES Act, surprising pretty much everybody, which goes to show, I think, that there's no way Congress thought that when they were writing these words, it gave the president the power to wipe out 95.5% of all student loans.
Oftentimes, when the Supreme Court takes up cases like this, it's not just about what's in front of that before them, but it also has to do with precedent setting and the powers of the legislative versus executive branch. Are there larger issues at play here that go well beyond just student loan forgiveness?
Yes, absolutely. One of them is just sort of the nature of executive power. To what extent can executive agencies look at really old statutes meant to do one thing and reinterpret them without congressional approval to do something else? That's a fundamental separation of powers issue. I mean,
Well,
after all, we vote for members of Congress. We don't vote for our bureaucrats.
well,
But
that's a
increasingly,
Well, I got to say, if I can jump in, that's a major issue that conservatives have tried to harness for years now, because between the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Education, the Department of Energy, they try to do these power grabs and legislate from within their agencies, going well beyond what legislators, lawmakers actually intended. So, could there be a sweeping decision here on student loans that actually reins that power back where it belongs in the hands of Congress?
I doubt it in this case. So the Supreme Court has articulated a doctrine that sort of begins to deal with this problem called the major questions doctrine, which is to say that Congress gets to decide major questions and not bureaucrats. I think that if they decide to decide this case on that basis, it'll be a fairly straightforward application of that doctrine and not some new big move. But
All right.
hopefully it will have the incentive, it'll cause the president to rethink aggressive expansions of his power.
I gotta say, I mean, you've got the Justice Department and the Education Department distorting Title IX to mean that, the sex definition involves men who present as women. I mean, that's a major question, aspect and application right there. This is not just a one-off for the Biden administration. They're making a habit out of it.
Right, and they've done it with the eviction moratorium, and they did it with the mask mandate and the vaccine mandates. It's Biden's MO. He does not want to wait for Congress. He does not want to try to go for bipartisan solutions through Congress. If he can take and reinterpret an old statute to give his bureaucrats more power, that is his preferred method of operation.
All right, Giancarlo, no chance here that the Supreme Court's going to decide, yeah, nobody's got standing, send it back to the appeals court to sort of sort that out, right? They're going to
Well,
reach it.
it is always a possibility. You just never know. The court's standing doctrine is kind of messy, really hard to predict how that could go.
Assuming that they determine at least either the states maybe the states have standing or someone has standing. Give us a prediction. I mean, this is the game today. What are you saying? 6-3, 5-4? What do you got?
Probably be a 6-3 or 5-4 decision against if the
All right, I'm
courts
putting all my
reaches
money on 6-3. Giancarlo, I'm coming after you if I didn't get it. Thanks for joining us. More to come on O'Connor tonight.